All right, and we're back with a new mini series called The Devil Comes to Town, and I will throw it away to Aaron for our first point of discussion today.
All right. So we're going to talk about, well, we were talking about financing this podcast. We kind of did we got halfway through a finance class, and then I realized there was a big problem in it
Is this
where,
there's a mindset thing?
yeah. Yeah, I realized I was trying to take these financial principles and kind of put them in a nice bundle and give them to people. But with the wrong mindset, they're just deflected.
Hmm.
So I thought we'll take a little break and we're going to talk about nihilism and see if we can just sort of break through it a little bit because these days everyone's a nihilist and a lot of the times they don't quite realize it.
Mm. Absolutely.
Um, yeah, it's funny. It used to be everyone was a Christian and they didn't really realize it. Like, everybody would go to school and in the morning they'd do like a morning prayer
Yeah.
before the class began. And, people who didn't consider themselves Christians still went through with that practice and they might have disliked it, but they still sort of, went through the motions.
They did the
And now we're in a
traditional.
society. Yeah, exactly. And now we're in a society where we're going through the motions of nihilism. And even if you don't think you're a nihilist, you've probably picked up a fair bit of it because it's everywhere at the moment. So,
Yeah. If you
um,
if you take the tradition out, you kind of replace it with something, even if it is nothing. You
yeah.
know.
Yeah, oh yeah, well, as a collective, we've definitely put nihilism in. Um, so the book we'll talk about, there's a book by Mark Twain called The Mysterious Stranger.
Mm.
It's a book where the principles of nihilism emerge in one character in the story and kind of spread like a virus.
Mm.
And it's very, very, very it's a very developed version of nihilism for quite an old book. So I think it's a good one to kind of look at. And the other thing I like about the book is it kind of plays out like a medieval episode of Rick and Morty with instead of Rick being a scientist, he's an angel, and it's kind of a fun book.
Yeah. Well, it seems to be that with the framework that the book is pushed in that we've discussed about that we've discussed in the past, there's some real wealth in trying to dig under the nihilism thing, which
Mhm.
you kind of have to go back that far when they were initially thinking the concepts or the emergence of the idea to be able to find the good solutions. Like I've heard a lot of authors say that, so this book seems to be the
Yeah,
gateway.
here's the thing too with this book. So Mark Twain puts the context of the book. He makes it a very sort of sheltered place. So they're in Austria in I think it's 1690. The book set in something like that,
Mm.
and that Mark Twain says Austria was a sheltered country. It's like it wasn't even 1690. It's like it was earlier. And then they're in a village in Austria that's kind of protected by the mountains from the outside world. And they say that this village hasn't been corrupted by all the happenings that's going on outside the world.
Mm.
They're very much a it's like it's like they're very much living in he says the age of belief.
Mm.
They have just unquestioned faith in the religious order. Um, and then the characters he puts forward in the book, there's Theodore, who's the son of the church organist.
Mm.
There's Nicholas, who's the son of the tavern owner, I believe.
Mm.
Geez, I hope I got that right.
I think is it the
No, Nicholas is the son of the judge.
yeah son of the judge?
Sorry.
No, you're good.
Yeah. And then Sethi's the son of the innkeeper.
Mm.
And we, at risk of stressing it too much, but this matters because there's a judge, the church, and then there's the innkeeper.
Mm.
They're kind of three facets of society here. and each one is a place where people can go to kind of like to find meaning. Like if there's something that's gone wrong, if someone's wronged you, you can go to the court, and the court will decide what's true in the situation.
Mm.
For like socialization, for kind of like enjoying life, like having kind of like pleasure and good time. The inn in this book, it's kind of like the local bar where everyone can go and kind of hang out and have a good time and dance. And it's on the bank of a river, and the river has boats that you can hire and row up and down, and it's meant to be like a real sort of place of like enjoyment.
Mm.
And then there's the church, and specifically with Theodore being the son of the church organist, like he's not the son of the priest who's kind of like ordaining the religious law. He's the son of the person who makes music in the church.
Yeah.
And I think the reason Mark Twain's done this is because he lays out two of the characters. There's two priests that kind of run the church, and neither of them are what we would consider to be good men.
Mm.
Like maybe good men for their time, although I wouldn't expect so. But kind of like these priests, they engage in well, one of the priests specifically, he engages in a bit of witch hunting in the local community, and he gets everyone riled up. And basically there'll be these ladies who are widows, who are the kind of people society should be protecting, and he'll rally a mob against them and accuse them of all sorts, and they'll end up executing them.
Mm.
So
Well,
there's something wrong in the religious order there.
yeah. Well, it seems like these three traits kind of, I've seen this before in other books where they have like a representation of society, spirituality, and also like pleasure seeking or like needs of the passions. And I don't think it's deliberate. I don't think he's. I think he's done this on an unconscious level in this book to really kind of tap into all the elements of how you live, and
Yeah.
that's interesting. And the point about the Theodore's father being the organist, it's like there's the music element of the spirituality, which is what a lot of people connect with. And it's like it goes above the education of spirituality. It's like the spirituality itself in music, which is like the art form of it, which is, you know, it's like pretty much the most opposite thing you can get from nihilism. It's like it's like it's like
Yeah.
one of the truest forms of meaning. It's like the opposite of it.
Yeah. It's crazy hard to be able to dodge the meaning of music when you hear a song that kind of resonates with your experience. And
Mm.
it's very interesting that that's even possible, that someone can, like, especially when it's a piece of music with no lyrics,
Mm.
and it doesn't have sound effects to tell you what's going on. Like sometimes you can just have a piece of music that everybody who's had a similar experience, and maybe it's a similar experience to the artist when he wrote it or she wrote it, whatever. You can kind of like, it's like everyone's experience kind of maps onto that sound, and you
Mm.
can all kind of understand it. It's very, very weird.
Yeah. And I just find it interesting that he's built these characters this way because it seems like he's built them up in a strong way for them to combat nihilism in the best way that they can in an underdeveloped child thinking. But it doesn't seem to be enough. It's like it's a little bit
Yeah.
underdeveloped. But anyway, I digress.
Well, yeah. Their one weakness is, despite the fact that they're in a sheltered and protected town, there's something off about the older people in the town. Almost similar to that It movie,
Mm.
where all the adults just have something off about them in varying degrees.
Mm.
Like
It's like a
my favorite
sickness.
example of that is when Georgie's playing by the drain. He gets taken by the clown and he disappears. And there's that old lady sitting on her porch who's looking out at him, looking out, checking on him. And then
Mm.
she sees he's disappeared, and she does nothing. It's like, you know what I mean? He was playing by the drain. Now he's disappeared.
Mm.
She's noticed he's gone. She doesn't investigate. She just goes back to what she's doing. Something very off about that. Like, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? If you saw the kid playing by the drain, especially because he'll fit through the gap, you should have you should have gone out straight away. Like, yeah,
Yeah, I know, right?
she sees it, lets it happen, lets it happen, lets it happen, sees evidence that he's, had something bad happen, and then she just ignores it.
It's almost
And then,
like
she's got
there's
that look on her face too.
if I can get the scene up, I'll pull it up and put it on the screen. But it's funny because it seems like there's like a corruptedness about it, and like you get that when you go to some places where there's a thinking that takes primary in the community, and everyone just seems weird. Like you get
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, so, so these boys, they're kind of in their society. They're not like, for instance, there's a lot of the worst sort of thing in the town is obviously the witch hunting. And in the witch hunting, the boys aren't into it. They don't really even think that it's like they're not true believers in witches for sure. Um, but yet, despite this, they can't stand against the town because they're kind of like they're young. They just don't have the power.
Plus, they think it's tradition. No, it's like it's like what the parents do.
Yeah, yeah. It's very hard for them to essentially, um, well, in their sort of society where everyone is a true believer, it's
Mm.
very hard to stand against the church.
It's like that group think, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Mm.
exactly. And that
Okay.
is something that everyone thinks they could stand against, and then when they run up against it, it's way, way harder than you'd ever suspect.
Yeah, it's corrupting, but it's also like I don't want to be singled out as the person that should get shot, you know.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
anyway,
So we got this town, and basically what happens is Satan takes the form of a young man, and he sees Nicholas, Theodore, and Seppi sort of they're playing by a riverbank, I think they are, and then he comes over and he kind of befriends them, and in the scene he's revealing his magic powers and he's showing them all sorts of things, and the kids are scared at first, but he wins them over because he's like he's good and charming, and in the scene he's showing them magic. But if you just imagine you went back in time and you tried to befriend a group of young children with your smartphone, if you were just to be like, look at it, and then they would go, and then you could say, no, no, look, it's got cool pictures, and look at this, look at that, and
mm,
you could kind of like you could probably win them over.
mm.
He manages to win them over using he does stuff. I know he freezes some things, and then there's a scene where he makes little clay men come to life, and he does all sorts of things.
Like
Um,
godlike kind of attributes.
yeah, exactly. And then what he does, which is quite funny, there's a good priest in the town, or he's as it's not clear that he's exceptionally good, but he's not bad. Um, I forget even his name, but basically he's going through hard times financially. So what Satan does is he makes some gold pieces appear, silver pieces, whatever they were. He leaves them in a bag along a pathway where that priest will be walking. The priest picks them up, and then Satan basically says to the boys, like, I did that for him. He needs the money. Hope he's happy, sort of thing. Satan disappears. The boys then go talk to the priest, and he's like, did you see anyone come along here? Um, and Satan's made it that the boys can't talk about Satan. They can't talk about anything Satan's done or said to them.
Mm.
So they have to lie to the priest. So he says, did you see anyone? And they say, not any human. Like, we saw no humans walking here. And, they have to kind of like, once they start engaging with Satan, they have to begin lying. And
Yeah,
it's,
engaging in the deception.
yeah, and it's very low level at first. And Satan wins him over with this. He's a priest. He's a good man. There's the other priest who's kind of like the bad, real strict guy that no one really likes. He's the tyrannical element. This priest is the one that seems a little warmer, a bit nicer. Um, he needs the money. He's found the money, but then he's saying to the boys, someone must have dropped this. And they're saying like, no, it's yours. This is, they use the word providence,
Mm.
which is kind of like a divine blessing of, I don't know, I suppose resources or luck or whatever.
Mm.
Weird word. We don't use it as much anymore anyway, but providence. They keep saying, this is providence. This is like divine willed good luck for you. Here you go, sort of thing. And he's saying like, it's very funny because he's a priest, but instead of being like, God has blessed me with this money, he says, no, someone would have dropped it. He's like,
Mm.
he's telling the boys, like, essentially, you're taking it too far here. You know, this is a lot of money. And it ends up being enough money that um, the priest, he owed some money to his, not his landlord, but basically he had his house mortgaged with someone in the town. They lent him the money for the house.
Yeah.
And then the priest had a bit of trouble with the church, and the church had cut him off from his sort of wages. So he was just working at the church, not receiving any money. It happened to be enough money for him to be able to pay his mortgage off, as well as have a little bit extra. So what he says to the boys is, he says, well, someone's lost this money. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give it to the person who I owe money to. And the person's kind of like operating as kind of like a medieval bank style, like they borrow and lend.
Yeah.
And he'll tell them, essentially, here's the money for my house. Don't kick me out,
Yeah.
But it's not my money. Someone's probably going to come and collect it. But until then, but should that happen, essentially, I'll borrow the money for the house off you again. But basically, it gets him out of his like foreclosure kind of situation.
Yeah.
So he does that, and then with this money introduced into the story, everyone turns to essentially like, he's a priest who's suddenly come across a lot of money. Everyone's like, he did something dodgy. He must have stolen something, or
I see.
yeah. That now there's a big distrust with him, with all the townspeople. So in his blessing, he's become kind of isolated socially. And then there's another person who lives in the town who happens to have lost the exact same amount of money. And by lost, I mean someone broke in and stole it. Like,
Yeah.
he'd heard that the priest had found this money, so he checked his money and he realized he was down that amount. So then there's, now he's isolated socially because no one believes the story. He just was walking and he found it. And then now there's going to be a court case, and it's all a big situation. And basically, along the way, one of the things that happens is this priest has a daughter. Satan comes along. Basically, he finds the housekeeper for the house, and he gives her a magic cat, which every day you own the cat, you get a certain amount of silver or gold, whatever it is. So now the household has this source of income that's coming magically from the cat, as well as when you own the cat, it's something like any food that you want will be in your pantry, something like that.
Yeah.
So now they've got all this food, all this money, income coming in. The priest hasn't been, kind of like the church hasn't said the priest is getting paid again. Everyone in the town's very sus on them, and it eventually leads to accusations of witchcraft and all sorts. So Satan's blessing ends up being like it's to torture the man, essentially.
Yeah. In the situation that he's given, you don't get like free calls. Like you just don't get that at all.
But this is one of the things that's great throughout the whole book. Satan essentially only takes action whenever the boys ask him to. And every time he takes action, he keeps pushing this situation. He's got heaps of people wound up in it. Like, I can't obviously get them all in. But he keeps on pushing it further and further. But it's these boys that ask him to do it. So they'll say, won't you help that person? And then Satan does it in such a way that, they end up having all sorts happen to them.
Yeah,
Um, I
it's crazy.
suppose there's a couple examples here. This is probably an example which will get us closer back to nihilism, because the presence of Satan in the story, he's always essentially he's corrupting like the meaning that they live in,
Mm.
despite the fact that their meaning that they live in was already kind of being corrupted by themselves.
It's getting.
But Satan tries to replace it.
Mm.
You go, well, you
I
go.
was just gonna say, it seems like the presence of Satan is escalating some form of societal destruction because they're saying, "Can you help these people?" Because they feel like they have a different moral compass, but it's actually accelerating the corruption, which is
Yeah, yeah,
literally the
and,
opposite of what they
and
want.
yeah, yeah, and like that can happen in a situation where two people really can't see eye to eye. Sometimes you can't reconcile this because one person will do something that they think is like, I'll make a nice gesture. And it ends up being the exact thing the person didn't want. And, it's always like, but
Yeah.
you can get in these sort of little comedies of life quite often. It is very similar to that episode of Rick and Morty where Morty wants the ability to, is it stop time, rewind time? So
Mm.
he wants the ability to rewind time if you've seen that one.
Yeah.
It's on the new season, I think. But basically, at the end of the episode, Rick reveals to him, because Morty's going out, he's doing stuff, having these real massive negative consequences. Then he rewinds time 10 seconds, and then he just goes on about his day like it never happened. It ends up being that every time he hit the button to rewind time, he was getting swapped to a parallel universe. And essentially, another Morty was getting swapped into the consequences or something like
Yeah.
that. So he's left this untold like wave of destruction through so many parallel universes just by acting on impulse, but never having to suffer the consequences.
Mm.
Um, that's very much what this Satan character's doing to these boys. He's given them a little bit of like a here's a thing that will help you,
Mm.
but every time it's something that helps, it leaves this like wave of destruction. But instead of being in a parallel universe, it's just coming.
Yeah.
It's just like he set something up that in the future it's going to go terribly wrong, and it's going to be the boy's fault for asking him the help. And he's, I believe he's doing it maliciously.
Yeah.
So
And
Satan, he pretends he's not, but
mm,
you're right. You go, well. You
I
go.
was I was just gonna say, it seems like it's got to be. He's a Satan character. He knows what he's doing. Like
Yeah,
like
I think.
yeah.
Um. So he lays out this kind of like he says that one between him and like humans, there's such a difference in ability that it's kind of like the difference between a human and an ant.
Mm.
And basically, he says to the boys, like, you know, everything I do may seem like it's morally wrong from your point of view, but you don't understand. He basically says that he's taking into account what's happening now, not just for the people involved in the situation, but everyone.
Mm.
And he says he's looking 1,000 years into the future as well. Um, and basically, what he says is like, yeah, he harms people, he does these situations where things go wrong, but essentially, he's taking into account so much information that that's how it has to be, so that we can reach like the optimal good in the future. Um,
Mm.
and then he also says there's kind of like he got a bit of like a chip on his shoulder about humanity in general. He says that humans have what's called the moral sense, in that we kind of have a view of what's right and what's wrong, but Satan says that it's like a corrupt sense,
Mm.
that if we could actually see into the future and see the consequences of our actions, we would realize that often what we think is the right thing to do is actually causing harm long term. And just because we have such limited information, we run about doing things and feeling like we're acting the correct way, but you know, really, to someone like him who's an angel who can see the actual results of our actions, he thinks that it's just like we're running around causing all sorts of harm,
Mm.
um,
It's like
which is quite ironic because Satan's running around causing all sorts of harm.
mm. It's like a weird double justification thing where it's like
Yeah,
he can see into the future, so therefore he is the only one that can make judgment of whether something is good or bad. But it's like there's multiple different futures. So it's like
yeah,
obviously if he can see into the future, he's picking a deliberate path of some sort. Whether it's to an
yeah.
ultimate good, which I guess in the sense of a nihilistic thinking, the ultimate good is the death of all humanity because none of it matters and it shouldn't have even existed in the first place. So it's like if that's the highest good for Satan, then any form of suffering that leads to the quickest death is going to be the route of least resistance.
Yeah, yeah. It's exactly like that. And he manages to trick the boys in another way by he starts laying out um let's say the afterlife. He starts factoring that into his decisions.
Hmm.
And he starts saying that yes, I did lay out the events in such a way that that person got killed, but if they died at that particular time in that way, they would go to heaven and have eternal bliss.
Hmm.
And if they had died any other time in any other way, they were going to hell for eternal hell. And he says essentially like the eternal suffering. I mean, it's like the threat of nuclear war. It's like it's hard to measure how much bad that has. It's
Hmm.
this infinite bad.
It's like the
So
concept
every
of
time,
bad.
yeah.
Hmm.
So every time Satan's doing his game theory for like the situation, anytime there's a pathway that leads to infinite bad, any action that gets you off that pathway is justified.
Hmm.
So keeps he keeps laying out these situations where essentially, well, it's like, what would you do to stop infinite bad? You would arguably,
Anything.
arguably, you can swap from infinite bad to like a million bad, and you're way better off.
Hmm. It's it's definitely better. I guess.
um, so here's a little bit of a scene on the moral sense, which is quite fun.
Hmm.
Um, there's a dog, and the dog is its owner is a drunk, and he likes to get drunk and abuse the dog, which he's also a loner. So there's just this guy who's a loner. He likes to get drunk and beat up his dog. It's the strangest. It's like what a shit guy.
Yeah, it's like he's the lowest of the low in the town, probably. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like Mark Twain really just sort of like he just laid out a very simple character there that this is a bad man. But the dog lacks the moral sense. So despite the fact that this man abuses the dog still has love for him and forgives him. And essentially, even though this man's the worst guy in the town, the dog, I mean, the dog's just so pure that it doesn't matter to the dog.
it kind of sees the goodness in everybody. Well, it's like well, that's what most animals do, unless unless they got a particular temperament and you kick them once, and then they're always like, you know,
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I always find this funny because I got a black cat, and sometimes in the darkness she'll lay in like the hallway, middle of the hallway. I just won't see her, and I'll step on her,
mm,
and she'll do what cats do, like she makes the noise and she runs away, and she doesn't know it's an accident. Like she thinks I've just done that. Like she thinks I'm like off to bed, lights off, and then like gave her a little quick stomp on the way through. Like,
yeah,
but the thing that's weird is she will forgive me pretty quickly if I'm like, no, no, sorry, and like I pat her and stuff. Um, she will forgive, and I'm like, the, does she not like? Does she know it's an accident, or does it not matter?
Yeah.
Like, to her, is she just like, hey, you lost your cool for a second, like,
She's like,
like,
this entity sometimes hurts me, but not all the time.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, it's so weird to think of, but yeah, animals do sort of. I mean, I think that if you repeatedly abuse an animal, I think they do pick up that viciousness that, like, you see it in some shelter dogs sometime where you go near the fence and like they're scared,
Mm,
and then you stay a little too long and then they're angry, like,
yeah,
like, I think you can change the temperament of an animal if you continually do the wrong thing, but it's just weird their tolerance for like forgiveness is so high.
yeah. Well, good for us, you know.
Yeah, yeah, good for us. Um so the human gets drunk and he's walking along a cliff and he ends up falling off down onto the rocks below, and he's injured, and he's essentially laying there dying. And the dog, who has suffered at the hands of this man, he runs to the town to get help, but everyone in the town, they're just busy, they're going about their day, they're not listening to the dog, they're not giving it any attention, they're just sort of shooing it away. And then it ends up being that because no one in the town would listen to the dog, the the drunk who had the fall, he ends up dying. And essentially, if everyone had just been a little bit earlier to find him, he would have probably survived.
Mm,
Um, and there's this, so Satan sort of has like a speech about it, and he says something along the lines of like, how can you, as a human, justify the actions of your species in that, this man was just nothing but awful to the dog?
mm.
And then he says, how can you say that you're above animals when, look at the purity this dog's displayed? And, often we think we're above animals. It's like, one, we have morality. Two, we have kind of like language and intellect. But Satan, you got to remember, is got such a higher intelligence than us that he basically views us and the dog as like the same level.
Mm.
Um, so he doesn't really let them have that
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 leg up,
quality.
yeah, that leg up.
Yeah. Um, and he basically says like, this dog's a beautiful creature, and you're all far worse than it. And
Oh
it's
my god, what a bad rut.
Yeah, he does that several times in the book. He lays out the difference between animals and humans, and he puts animals above. And he says that animals are above because we're essentially animals that have been corrupted by morality. Which morality, a disbelief in morality is one of like the foundational tenets of nihilism. Is
Mm,
they can't quite, because nihilists believe that there's no meaning to the universe. Without there being kind of like a meaning, it's very hard to have a foundation for morality that perhaps is, I don't know, solid enough not to be budged should a situation, offer the ability to do something that might be considered immoral in some circumstances, but, you'd be like, in this situation, it's okay. Like,
mm.
that's kind of like all the nihilists have a foundation that's got a lot of wiggle room.
Yeah, and they shift very easily. It's almost like I, this is gonna sound so aggressive, but I don't mean it to be. But if you think that everything's meaningless, then you can use it as a cop out to not be a good person. And not only that, you can justify a lot of decisions just based on that premise. And it's not. There's better ways to be, you know.
Oh, 100%. And
Mm,
it, it's quite funny. Like, there's a, there's kind of like an intensity of a situation that will make your philosophy kind of like come forward.
mm,
And one of the things people used to talk about was they were in a situation. A good example is in Anna Karenina, when Levin, one of the main characters, his child's being born. There's a complication in the pregnancy, and um, I can't remember exactly what it is, but something along the lines of perhaps the baby didn't come out quite the right way or something, and it ended up being very painful for his wife, who he loves very dearly.
Mm.
Anna Karenina is set in the past, but it's like the romance like the love that guy has for his wife it's nothing like the old kind of like, God. Sometimes people look at romance in the past, and there's kind of like a women were property kind of like
Like a trope.
thing, which
Yeah.
yeah, and like obviously if you had to believe women were property and they got to do what they're told, sort of thing, um, maybe it would be a little hard to have like perhaps in the modern world what we would call romance emerge as part of your life. But
Yeah.
I mean, he doesn't think he owns her. He's just like, he's loved her forever, and then it ends up being that he ends up getting to marry her, and it's he's very much he's in love, and she's in all this pain, and it's not clear whether she'll survive and the baby will survive. And in the stress of the moment, because obviously he's just kind of, it's not really much he can do.
Mm.
He starts sort of panicking, and in his panicking he begins to pray, and he prays. He finds it quite funny to suddenly realize, yes, he does believe in God, and he's he's desperately asking for help in this moment.
Mm.
And it's kind of like he wrestles with his faith in the book as to whether or not he is a Christian, and then when it comes down to it, he found out he was.
Mm.
You don't want to be in a situation where you find out you're a nihilist, because odds are you're going to do something that's out of alignment with the truth, out of alignment with morality, and there will be consequences for you and other people that'll stretch on for like a long time.
Mm.
Um,
Don't look any further than Mark Twain's book, because yeah, like there's some horrible stuff in that book. But yeah, we were speaking about this the other day at work when we were like, you don't unearth what your true, I don't know, beliefs are until they actually get tested. And then when they get tested, it's like sometimes you're like, oh, I actually give a shit. Like,
yeah, yeah.
that's hard to deal with in the moment. But anyway, moving on.
So there's another thing that Satan doesn't like about humanity. There's a scene where they hang a lady. They've hanged her because they've accused her of being a witch, and there's not really any sort of trial or anything. They just hang her. Like it's a lynching essentially.
Yeah.
And as they've got her strung up, everyone in the town's throwing stones at her, and they're not throwing stones because they dislike the lady. Like, this lady's lived in their town. She seemed to be good enough to everyone. No one has a particular grievance with her.
Hmm.
Um, but everyone's throwing stones out of fear that their neighbors will see them not throwing stones. And if you're seen not throwing stones, well, then, maybe you sympathize with the witch, and maybe you're a witch as well. And then, trouble will descend upon your household. So
Hmm.
everybody throws stones. And then Satan, who can read minds, reveals to one of the main characters, Theodore, that out of all 50 people that were there throwing stones, oh, sorry, no, wait, 68 people there, only 60, out of 68 people there, only 6 wanted to throw a stone.
Hmm.
62 people didn't want to throw stones.
They were following the group.
Exactly. And Satan, essentially, he thinks that's funny,
Hmm.
which, no, it's not very good.
It's funny in the context of the book, but you end up in those situations all the time, and you always feel so sick afterwards. You know,
Yeah.
like
I think we might even be seeing it a little bit with the invasion of Ukraine, where I don't know if, I mean, this is what you'd say if you were captured, but some of the Russian soldiers seem to be saying, we didn't want to invade. We didn't know we were invading. We thought we
mm,
were on a training exercise. And they kind of like they're saying that they didn't know what was going on, essentially. They were just following the group. And it's very interesting to see it emerge in such like a recent event, And it's one of those things that's going to be very, very hard to sort out for a long time. Like,
It's
um,
very
yeah,
very strange that that would be the answer from them, but it proves that I guess that there's not as much malevolence in the individual than you would, I guess, be pushed to believe by society. But
yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
hope they're all doing
So
well over there.
yeah, yeah, well, it's terrible.
Mm.
The Okay, so why are we talking about nihilism? That's probably something worth
Mm. Yes.
bringing up. Although now that we spoke about this book, I mentioned it at the beginning, but it's easier to map this on to like a Rick and Morty model if you're not as familiar with, say, the historical context of the book, or um the kind of like there's kind of like a Christian dogma that this book is kind of witnessing the collapse of, and we're so far removed from it at this point in time that it doesn't really hit home.
Mm.
Um, but the book it's a great book anyway. You can think about this sort of stuff in the context of Rick and Morty, where compared to Rick, Morty is somewhat an insignificant character
Mm.
compared to Rick's abilities. You know, it's like Rick can do anything, anywhere.
Anytime.
Um, yeah, it's Rick is essentially a god compared to Morty.
Mm.
Um, and often there's points in the story where Rick really rubs that in.
Mm.
And it's true. Rick is superior. I mean, he's definitely superior in intellect. He's definitely had a richer and wider variety of experience. Um, but
It's uncanny how much that maps on. By the way.
yeah, yeah. And I don't know what the exact way to say, but that's kind of like the relationship between nihilism and kind of like hopeful youth, like
Mm.
potential. Um,
It does.
Often yeah, you go.
I was just gonna say it. Nihilism often crushes not only other people in your thinking, but also your own thinking and potential.
Mhm.
Which is one of the main points that I think is important about this episode and the following episode is that if you're unaware of being nihilistic, it can be very dangerous for you and everyone involved.
Yeah, yeah. Well, definitely where nihilism intersects with the world is when somebody says they want to do something that's essentially like there's a potential for something good to happen. I'm going to try and make it happen. And that's when nihilists will often sort of say, yes, there's the potential for this good thing, but have you thought of this and have you thought of that? And they'll
Mm.
start laying out the reasons why it might not work. And they'll start like it's it's a very funny thing because it's very nihilistic to be like to attack people at the point of like hopeful potential. That's very much a thing nihilists do, and I've always been a little confused on it because the exact definition of the philosophy is that they reject general or fundamental aspects of human existence, such as objective truth, knowledge, morality, values, or meaning.
Mm.
But when you speak to people who have this nihilistic kind of like viewpoint, often they'll try use objective truth to tell you why something's wrong.
Well,
Like they kind of try to wield science against you sometimes, and you'd be like, "What are you doing, nihilist?" Like,
it's kind of weird because I've always seen it as they take the path that suits them to the best to be able to win the argument. It's
yeah, yeah, yeah. They're very opportunistic in their. It's like the only thing that matters is the potential and kind of like. Well, I
change,
like the term. Yeah, the will to death. They just want to like imbue everything with the will to death.
and it's like it's stressed the unconscious element of this Because it's like you could be seeming like you're doing something that's smart, but really you're just being a nihilist, and it's not getting it's not getting you anywhere. You know?
Yeah. I think the difference is sometimes someone will say they want to do something, and someone will say, perhaps they've got like knowledge and experience relating to the thing. They'll say, there's this element of it that's difficult. Have you got a plan for dealing with that? Could I suggest you get your hands on, this tool, or maybe you want to look at this book, or you want to be ready for this particular thing to happen because it snuck up on me and it made it more difficult. And then what the person's done is they've said, I have a thing, it's got some potential. You've done like an attack on it, but you've also kind of like the bit that you've attacked, you've reinforced after the attack, and
Mm.
you've basically swapped something that was weak for something that was strong. Whereas someone will say, I want to do this. And I think a nihilist will take a part of it that's good and got potential, and they'll kind of say, oh, but it will be difficult. And they've kind of taken the good part and they've swapped it out for this general, like, oh, it's difficult.
Yeah, and
Um,
that doesn't necessarily help.
no, not at all. um, and like the reason why we did this episode, um, I reveal to the audience that this is the second time we're recording it. The
Yeah.
first time we recorded it, I had just found out that I was on track to get a farm, and it was like, looking very likely.
Mm.
And now we're a couple weeks later, and it is looking like I'm definitely getting the farm. One of the things I told people when I said I was going to get a farm, which one, I've not been a farmer before. Like, I've grown some stuff, but I've not had like acres of land to manage.
In saying that, you have actually grown some like some pretty good food, more than I've ever seen
Yeah,
anyone else do. So
yeah, well, yeah.
you're not heading for disaster, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I shouldn't be. Although I mean, I'm definitely heading to. I'm either going to expand what I know, or I'm going to have some problems. Like,
Yeah,
um,
a
but there
tipping
were some
point.
people that were saying stuff where I think, actually, to give a little bit of context, this isn't my first property, so I've already brought two properties before. The farm thing, I've been researching um, the type of farming that I want to do for it's a couple years, but I first begun researching agriculture in general. Like maybe it was 2016, I read my first book on the topic, something like that. Um, it's
Hmm.
like, I'm not going into this whole process kind of like completely ignorant. But then I was having people say to me, oh, but what about the finances? Are you sure you can afford it and stuff like that? And I understand what they're doing. They're trying to make sure, well, maybe they are. Maybe they're trying to make sure I don't get myself into like a situation where I end up going bankrupt, which
Hmm.
fair enough. But a lot of these people who are saying this don't own any property. And they don't understand that after the surge that the property markets had over the last 12 months, that financially, this kind of move is like, while not the safest, it's not like it's like I can have several things go wrong before I've got no cash to throw at it.
See,
Um,
it it's weird because anyone who would know you for a long enough time should be able to realize that this is something that you've wanted and you want the challenge. And it's like
yeah,
like that's what I don't understand when you take on like there's a couple of things here because when you take on a challenge, if you truly want it, you will just throw whatever you can at it until it works. And it's like a nihilist can't do that. Like,
yeah. The nihilist philosophy, I think, when it encounters problems, it says, "Ha, things are bad, confirmed,"
yeah.
and then it doesn't continue pushing against that.
Hmm.
Like it's. I think that's why it's such a weak philosophy to run at your foundation, is because it just takes your your drive away entirely.
Hmm. And like just to add to the point before is like I remember a friend of mine was talking to me about how she thought that it was such a good thing that her partner would tell her when she wasn't good enough to do a certain thing in his mind, and that would decide her path forward into her future of, say, not doing study this year because she's not mentally prepared. It seems like it's coming from a caring perspective, but it can be incredibly, it's questionable. You hear it come out of my mouth and
Oh
you
yeah,
step back and you go, "Oh, you is this actually a form of care?" And it's like, well, in my eyes, it's like a little bit of challenge never goes astray. But if that seems like a nihilistic thing to say, it's like, oh, you're not ready. It's just gonna be pain, you know? Like,
yeah, yeah. No, that's
yeah.
100%. And like the thing that's annoying is to get to like a level where perhaps you can call yourself successful. You've probably got to do like 3 or 4 impossible things
Mm,
back to back. And there is a pathway through life where you can like it's very very hard to get from say 0 to 1 million,
mm.
but you'll probably have a bunch of false starts where you'll get to 0 to 50 grand to complete another mental and physical collapse, and then you got to start again, and then you keep like everybody I think who's successful has had a couple false starts getting away from zero, or at least the majority of people, because it's so hard to go from 0 to 1 million, and it's so hard to go from 0 to 50,000. And essentially, you'll fuck it up so many times, and you'll get exhausted, and life will seem not worth living, and you'll you'll probably break some of like the mental architecture on the way through and have to rebuild it. And it, it it's so funny, but there's this argument people have that the people who are successful often went from zero to like a high level of success very quickly. And it's like, yes, but one, was that their first rodeo? Because they might have gone 0 to 10,000, 0 to 10,000, 0 to 50,000, 0 to several times before they had the ability to like get it up off the ground.
Mm.
And I'm pretty sure that that's corrupting the idea that there's this 1 in 1,000 person who gets successful easily and the rest of us are struggling. Like there are people who do have a good run quickly. They get a little bit of luck on their side, but usually long term that's not a good thing. Like you end up a bit like the priest who found the money. Everyone will kind of be like, how'd you do it? And they might even have like a little bit of like a distrust that maybe you've ripped people off and stuff like that. And without having the maybe like the war stories, like to be able to be like, you ever have a very close friend die and then get back to work, like you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
I get you.
Like without having the war stories to kind of justify your success.
Reminds me of the 50 Cent thing, by the way.
What's the 50 Cent thing?
You told me that apparently 50 Cent was saying that in one of his interviews or a book or something, you were telling me that he had people around him that were like
Oh
there for years and then just to backstab you. And it's like,
yeah,
oh, fuck off. And it's like a nihilist would do that because they wouldn't value the friendship. Like it's an element of
yeah,
nihilism.
yeah. Well, they wouldn't. They especially wouldn't value his success
Mm,
because they'll look at him as a man who made some music and got rich, and they'll be like, there's people working in factories that are working 10 times as hard, and they're ruining their bodies and all that. And here's 50 Cent, lounging around in his big mansion, living off of money for music he's already wrote and released.
mm,
And they won't acknowledge the war stories he has. And that's a guy who's got, he's got a ton of war stories, like,
mm.
and they won't acknowledge that that suffering was part of the process. Um, so what 50 Cent was saying was, yeah, after he become very very successful, I think what happened was he kind of lost a lot of the people from like the early days of his life.
Mm.
Perhaps maybe just his family getting older and stuff like that. I don't know. But then his friends kind of like, you lose a friend now and again. And the people he was replacing him with often in terms of either business relationships or, socially, they were really just interested in his money. And what he kept finding year after year was that people he had known who he thought he could trust, they were just in it for like, this long haul kind of like try get a bit of money from him. And it made him very unsure of who he could trust.
Mm.
And then, you know, very, very hard to have a relationship and stuff like that, like a romantic relationship if that's the position you're in. It's almost like in some respects he got success without
Suffering for it.
he lost something on the way up,
Yeah.
he definitely lost something. And that's often the trouble of having like a high level of success rapidly, is that things are lost.
Mm. It seems like I would argue that any artist that has suffered dearly and released music that I guess taps into the element of suffering is encapsulating something that I guess, what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that they deserve it because they've tapped into a pure problem and
Yeah.
extracted out the essence of it. But if you're a nihilist, you don't ever have the feeling of meaning that deep. Like
No, I didn't think so.
I wrestled with nihilism for many many years when I was growing up, and it's not an easy thing to get underneath either. And it's like you miss a whole chunk of life, and you can't save money while you're a nihilist. Like I'm just lucky that I got the conscientiousness with it, you know.
Yeah. And yeah, nihilism's definitely a bad philosophy to pick up first, and it's an easy one to pick up first because it's so ingrained in our culture, and it's so easy to learn, kind of like the rules of it.
Hmm.
Um, but because you have a there's no meaning, when when someone presents you with a philosophy that's based in meaning, which would be entirely better for you to swap over to, you can't do it because you're like, well, I don't believe in meaning.
Hmm.
That's not it's not good. Also,
It's
on a side note, 50 Cent has been shot 9 times, including his legs, hands, arms, face, and chest. So it's like anybody that says that he was, too successful, it's like, no, like, like,
take 9 bullets standing up for something that you care about. Take 9 bullets, you know.
yeah. It's like sometimes you can look at someone who's successful who doesn't appear to be working as hard as you work in the moment. And you can use that as an indication sometimes that one, perhaps you're not working as efficiently as you could be,
Hmm.
or two, perhaps you're working too hard because no one does their best work when they're tired. And a lot of what is sort of like success generating is relationship based with other people. And if you're exhausted and you're in a bad mood, it makes it very, very hard to connect with other people in such a way that they're going to have your back when you need them.
Hmm.
So,
I wonder.
so yeah, it's like sometimes you can work too hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can buffering that with nihilism. You can stop caring real quick. You know.
Oh, yeah.
Um. I wonder how much 1 bullet equates to in years of work. Like, if you get
Yeah, I don't know.
shot, if you get shot in the chest, is it like, oh, that's 2 years of wages? Like,
It should probably be way more.
is it like 2 years of worth of experience in one moment? But is there any other points you want to add to the end of this one, Mister Aaron?
Um, in the next episode, we begin by wrapping up the book.
Mm.
So I should just say the main character's name is Theodore, and where we begin in the next episode, the devil's essentially going to appear and he's going to tell him that, God, essentially he's going to lay out the nihilist foundation massively. So
Mm.
if you're still not exactly clear on what nihilism is, it's okay because it's somewhat like we could have tried to be technical about it, but I don't think it would have helped because nihilism is everywhere,
Hmm.
and it's in people. It's often in people in like their weakest moments, and it doesn't even have to be that weak of a moment, really. Um,
You start to notice it in like if you start to become aware of the concept of nihilism and you actually take on, I guess, some of the things that were spoken about in this episode, you might be able to see it in reality. And when you see it in the environment, it's a lot scarier than when you couldn't see it.
yeah, yeah, it's awful and it's everywhere, and like you'll hear it in people that you care about, and you'll be like, ah, no, like like that. There's a monster there that's kind of got like it's got a tentacle wrapped around them, and
Mm,
you just want to sever people away from it, but because it's so ingrained in our culture at the moment, it's so hard to get people out of it.
yeah.
I'm hoping that what we've done today is kind of like a soft, kind of like a soft introduction, which I don't know. I'm hoping that it will leave people thinking that there's something that they're not aware of, or if they are aware of it, kind of like just kind of like they can see where nihilism is and it's likely to appear, and then yeah,
It's
hopefully next episode will break through.
yeah. And to buffer on that, these things are in books and they play the stories play out in reality. These aren't these aren't brand new things that don't have answers. It's like these things go
Oh yeah,
way back, and they appear everywhere. So you're not like if you're experiencing nihilism for the first time or becoming aware of it, it's like we've just got to dig in and do a little bit more reading. Like it's not the end of
yeah,
the world. It's nothing. Nothing doesn't not matter.
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a funny thing in Henry David Thoreau's book. Is it Life at Walden or something like that? I can't remember, but I think he's writing in 1860-ish. I can't remember, but he he's talking about how the quality of education's declining, how the people are losing their bond with nature. He's saying that essentially landlords have too much power, they can charge too much for rent. He's saying that we have to swap our time, that it's not right that we swap our time so that we can earn a wage, so that we can have money, so that we can spend on things, so that we can essentially have a good time, if that makes sense.
Mm,
Like he doesn't like that there's this sort of hourly wage thing that's sort of corrupting people's relationship with their day-to-day life, where they're not doing what they want to do, they're constantly working. And he
mm,
doesn't like that they're working for someone else, within someone else's vision. They're not kind of figuring things out for themselves.
mm,
He writes about how the quality of education's declining. He writes about all sorts of things, which in my mind were post-industrial revolution problems
mm,
that perhaps we're reaching a tipping point today. But he's writing pre-industrial revolution, as is this book, The Mysterious Stranger. I think it's pre-industrial revolution. I'm not quite sure,
mm.
but it's very funny to see nihilism was already there, already emerging. It was essentially already in its full form, like
Mm.
with the type of nihilism Satan lays out in The Mysterious Stranger. No one's really gone beyond it, I don't think. Like,
No, there's some forms of answers, but it's still not it's not an easy dragon to get wrestled to the ground. And
yeah, oh yeah, but I just mean that it's a very clear version of nihilism. That's just what we have today. Like,
yeah. Oh, okay, the representation. Yeah, I see.
yeah, it's the same damn nihilism. Like,
Same damn dragon. Uh, all right, we'll wrap it up for here and then explore on these ideas after part 2. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a lovely day.
cheers.
Ciao.